All of these conditions from the post-colonial legacy can help bring about what we can call this neocolonial circle. Neocolonialism exists when you become politically independent but still economically dependent on the former master. And there are a lot of reasons for this. They're linguistically the closest. You were educated in their language. You understand their culture. There's a shared production and trade relationship. You may have a shared currency. All of these things keep you within that realm that's already been established for decades, hundreds of years potentially, depending on when the colonial experience began. And political power and economic power are fungible. So economic means political and political means economic. A lack of the rule of law and decent investment conditions, international investments missing. So you've got this ongoing poverty. You miss out on jobs. There's no new know-how coming in. There's no new technology transfers coming in. High corruption means that you've got an enormous informal economy. Often a majority of GDP is estimated to be in the black or gray markets. This means that the state can't tax it. They can't regulate it. So you may have people who are working long hours for practically nothing, creating profit potentially for those in charge, who then don't have to contribute towards Social Security, Medicare, and all those other things that we take for granted because the state can't tax them. For those less well off in the informal economy, which is the majority, who don't have employees, they suffer because it's hard for them to expand. They can't get, for example, bank loans without showing their bookkeeping. If they want to expand, they often have to pay high rates because it's high risk loans on the black market. That's the only place that they'll actually get these loans. So if you look at the neocolonial circle, we've got an incompetent, corrupt administration, a lack of public goods, people, so that's right here, people therefore work in the informal economy. There's violence because you can't even police your own state adequately. This leads to a poor investment climate, which prevents all the fruits of globalization, new technology, new know-how from coming in, and this maintains this sort of incompetent, corrupt administration. It maintains the status quo and the informal economy, and it goes in a circle. So it's not easy. Life in post-colonial states is often characterized by social schisms that were fostered by the imperial order, with established haves and have-nots, so inequality. Violence is often thus ethnically or class-based, especially urban versus rural, as each side wants a share of the state benefits. And when they get a hold of this share of the state benefits, and in particular the ability to have jobs in the state, they hold on tight to these. The state has a complete lack of legitimacy. It can't protect its people. It can't provide basic public goods or political goods. It often represents a particular group, usually an ethnic group that means that other groups are going to be left out. And then the question is, well, what do? Do you secede? What do you do? But these are the sorts of problems that lead us to these national crises, and military coups are a function of all this. The picture that you see here is one of the coup in Chile. People demand, corrupt leaders can't deliver or won't deliver, and every once in a while the military steps in and promises to bring things back to the people. And you do have a series of military coups that have taken place, for example, across Africa and parts of Asia. So now we could talk a little bit about ways out of neocolonialism, some escape strategies. The first one we'll talk about is import substitution. With import substitution, states create conditions for local industry by protecting and investing in this local industry. They put up various trade barriers. They provide subsidies to local companies. They allow for and even encourage patent violations. They might facilitate patent violations, stealing the recipes from the West or whoever's making something and then making it more cheaply at home. Now, import substitution is designed to be temporary, but it's very hard to stop in actuality. So here are some of the problems that it causes. There's a lack of competition by nature. If you're putting up trade barriers, giving subsidies, doing all these things, you're not going to have competition, which means that the industries that are being supported are going to be less innovative. They're going to be less efficient. They're also going to be a very concrete drain on the treasury. The state is literally paying for these to exist in one way or another, either directly or indirectly. Um, it's also a very slippery slope. If one industry or set of industries gets these, set of companies, well, then everyone's going to want them. You're going to have high demand from other sectors to receive this government support. And finally, you have this permanent dependence on the state. It's very difficult to break away from this because they're less innovative, because they're less efficient. Um, it's harder to get away to get out from under the wings of the state. So I'll give you an example of this. In Chile in 1939, the Popular Front government created the quote-unquote Production Development Corporation. This was designed to give subsidies and make direct investments in certain key industries, especially in manufacturing. Now, this was great during World War II because you had the loss of access to many imported products. And at first you had real growth, great growth, but this wasn't sustainable. The government had introduced various restrictions, controls, often contradictory regulations tailored to particular companies. And at its peak, they had around 500 state companies by the early 1970s. But in reality, these companies were producing for the local market. These weren't competitive goods that could be sent abroad. And you had high levels of poverty locally. Rural demographics of the local population meant that you were really producing for people who couldn't buy. So the local population can't buy. The global market won't buy because these are not very good products. And so what you have is the over-reliance and dependence on state subsidies or state protection, which meant that you have lots of inefficient companies that are surviving. And there was no incentive for capital markets to come in to take the state's place. Why would you take a loan from a commercial bank when you have to pay higher rates for that and you're getting free money from the state anyway? There's no incentive for them to come in. So you don't have what we call these capital markets. So those who give loans and sort of spur growth of companies to even come in. You don't have an incentive for them to come in. Now, an alternative route here is export-oriented industrialization. The state again is promoting local industry, but to compete on global and really primarily only on the global market to bring in hard currency. So the state here focuses on attracting top technologies to be the most efficient in a given sphere. An example of this is South Korea in the early 1960s. Here, this is a state where you had poor natural resource endowment. You had a high savings rate. In other words, people weren't spending a lot. And you had a tiny domestic market in terms of population, but also because of the high savings rate. So clearly import substitution wasn't going to work on its own. Import substitution, again, relies on a local market. So instead, they promoted economic growth through labor-intensive manufactured exports. Cheap labor is what gave South Korea its competitive advantage. The government initiatives at first were key. Policy planners selected a group of strategic industries to back. They backed electronics firms, shipbuilding companies, car companies. And then they made importing these goods that these companies produced difficult. So this is sort of a la import substitution, using tariffs, using other trade barriers. And then they actively supported the exports by reducing tariffs on raw materials that were coming in that were necessary for the goods, by providing tax exemptions for these companies, various ways that they could actually boost these exports, and literally marketing some of the goods abroad. Now the result was that you had a rapid growth in exports and a subsequent increase in income. During the 1970s, Korea had one of the world's most productive economies. Industrial production, the growth rate was about 25%. There was a five-fold increase in the GNP, the gross national product, from 1965 to 1978. In the mid-1970s, exports increased by an average of 45% a year, just astronomical growth. But it also left the rural sector relatively underdeveloped, and you had an income disparity, which arose between the industrial sector and the agricultural sector, which led to serious problems by the 1970s and remained a problem despite government efforts to raise farm income and improve rural living standards. So you had this haves versus have-nots coming in. So all this brings us to that 800-pound gorilla in the room. This is our game. The West has created the conditions that exist. The West controls the markets in many ways. Frequently, they've forced states to adopt systems like their own in order to qualify, for example, for aid. In multilateral institutions where the U.S. dominated, things like the World Bank, the IMF, they often provided and continue to provide structural adjustment loans in return for privatization, ending subsidies, reducing trade barriers, opening the state up to foreign direct investment, reducing the size of the state. All the things that are supposed to make them quote-unquote modern capitalist economies. Now, where these economies are disadvantaged, people are poor, or the state is seen as a political prize, this is really hard to do. More recently, they've been trying to help those who are in the gray market or with very low incomes by providing microcredits. And this isn't the IMF and World Bank. This is more smaller operations. Actually, some of them have grown quite large, and they've been backed in part, or been backed up at least diplomatically, and sometimes, I believe, economically, by states. So the idea is that you're going to give a small loan to a group, and then, for example, a group that offers cell phone services. Okay, give them a $20 loan, to each person within that group. They're going to invest, they're going to buy a cheap phone, and they're going to start this company. They repay that loan, and you give them a $40 loan, and it grows and grows and grows. It's a really interesting model. It adds peer pressure to the equation, because if one person in the group doesn't repay, well, then they get really pushed into repaying by their peers. So you get ever greater amounts to borrow as you work up a reputation, and there's been lots of luck with this. So they've been incorporated into the neoliberal economic order, but there are ways politically to try to deal with this by affecting domestic change. For example, by pushing for the rule of law, by breaking the cycle of corruption. Now, we can do this, but it's really difficult. You can do it through diplomatic pressure. You can use economic leverage. But it's very difficult because it's so entrenched. Finally, you can try to transform the political culture of a state. And what I mean finally is I'm just giving you some ideas. There are plenty of ways that we've attempted and continue to attempt to do this. But these are just a couple to get you thinking. So by transforming the political culture, what I mean is by applying indirect pressure through civil society. So support local non-governmental organizations. Allow them to blossom in places where otherwise they wouldn't be able to function because they don't have the economic conditions necessary. If you think about what it means to create, organize, and run a non-governmental organization, it means abdicating from your normal job. It means you're devoting a full-time career to this organization. This organization might be important in terms of providing information to policymakers locally on the ground. It might be important in terms of serving as a rallying group, a mobilizing group that can get other people in the population, whether in your particular economic sphere or whatever you're talking about, the issue sphere, people who are interested in this issue, to actually come and put pressure on the government through rallies and things like that. So one thing the West has done is supported civil society. People who educate others on their rights, who help with organizing other civil society organizations so that this blossoms, it goes on. So these are some ways that the West has tried to do this. But again, there are lots of problems. But one of the underlying problems being the fact that the West has created this, and in many ways it remains advantageous for Western companies to have the conditions as they are. So we're going to stop here, and that's all we're going to do on less developed countries. And next time we'll come back and we'll talk about globalization.